Deep in the ash-choked ruins of what was once a thriving world, 5 million bodies burned on funeral pyres that stretched across an entire planet. The fortresses that had once been symbols of architectural genius now lay broken, their walls breached by the very weapons designed to defend them, and standing amid the carnage, watching his homeworld die, was the man who had ordered it all. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, the Lord of Iron himself. This is the story of how one of the Emperor's greatest sons committed an act so terrible that it sealed his damnation forever. The destruction of Olympia wasn't just another battle in the Great Crusade, it was patricide, matricide, and suicide all rolled into one terrible moment of rage and despair. When the pyres finally cooled, Perturabo knew with absolute certainty that his father, the Emperor of Mankind, could never forgive what he had done. But Horus Lupercal could, and in that moment of realization, the galaxy's fate was sealed. The question isn't just why Perturabo destroyed Olympia. The question is how a being of such towering intellect, such mathematical precision, such supposed rationality, could commit an act of such unfathomable brutality against his own people. To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning, to a child found climbing mountains with no memory of where he came from, and trace the long, bitter road that led to the moment when the Iron Warriors turned their guns on the only home they'd ever known. Before we enter the 41st millennium, a simple request. Subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium. For you, it's a simple tap. For me, it's proof of loyalty that keeps the Inquisition from auditing my existence. The Emperor protects those with good metrics. Now, let the story begin. According to Perturabo himself, he was born around the year 792 of the 30th millennium, but like all his brother Primarchs, his birth was anything but natural. Created in gene laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, Perturabo was one of 20 godlike beings designed by the Emperor to lead humanity in its reconquest of the galaxy. But the Chaos Gods had other plans. In an act of cosmic theft, they scattered the infant Primarchs across the stars, each landing on a different world, each shaped by radically different circumstances. Perturabo's gestation capsule crashed into Olympia, a mountainous world in the Ultima Segmentum, on the opposite side of the galactic core from Terra. The planet was ancient, settled during the latter days of the Dark Age of technology, and by the time Perturabo arrived, it had regressed into a collection of warring city-states. The geography dominated everything on Olympia. Vast mountain ranges carved the world into isolated regions, and military power depended on controlling the high passes and constructing impregnable fortresses from the abundant stone. It was a world tailor-made for a genius of siege warfare, even if no one knew it yet. For at least a year, perhaps longer, the young Perturabo wandered alone through Olympia's wilderness. Tales spread among the rural communities of a strange boy who slew legendary beasts with his bare hands, who could craft incredible works of art and engineering despite his youth, who moved from settlement to settlement, never staying long enough to put down roots. These weren't mere stories. Perturabo, even as a child, possessed abilities far beyond mortal understanding. He was stronger, faster, more intelligent than any baseline human could ever hope to be. But he was also utterly alone, with no memory of his origins, no understanding of his purpose, and no one who could relate to what he was. The guards of Logos, one of Olympia's most powerful city-states, eventually tracked down this wonder child in the mountains. They found him climbing the peaks below their city with the ease of a mountain goat, showing no signs of fatigue or fear. Recognizing immediately that this was no ordinary child, they brought him before Dammekos, the tyrant of Logos. Now, that title requires some explanation. On Olympia, a tyrant wasn't necessarily what we might think of today. The word carried different connotations in the ancient Greek-inspired culture of Olympia. Tyrants were rulers who held power through a combination of military strength, political cunning, strategic marriages, and yes, sometimes outright intimidation and fear. They weren't kings by divine right or elected officials. They were strongmen who clawed their way to the top and stayed there through constant vigilance against assassins, rival warlords and internal plots. Dammekos was particularly good at this game. He'd held power in Lokos for decades, navigating the treacherous waters of Olympian politics with a shrewd mind and ruthless pragmatism. When Dammekos looked at this strange boy, he saw opportunity. Here was a child of obviously superhuman ability, one who could tip the balance of power on Olympia forever. So he took Perturabo into his household, raising him not just as a ward but as a son. He gave the boy a place in his family alongside his 3 biological children, Heracon and Andos, his sons, and Calliphone, his daughter. Dammekos noticed immediately that Perturabo's intellect was overwhelming. The boy excelled at everything. Architecture. He designed fortifications that made Olympia's greatest engineers weep with envy. Combat. He mastered every weapon put in his hands and developed new tactics that revolutionized warfare on Olympia. Political debate. He could argue circles around seasoned courtiers while still a child. The arts. His technical skill was beyond reproach, even if, as would later become clear, his work lacked a certain emotional depth that troubled him deeply. Perturabo became a wonder, a living treasure that helped Lossos secure alliances with neighbouring city-states. Who wouldn't want to ally with the tyrant who commanded such a prodigy? The boy's genius was used to broker deals, intimidate rivals, and establish Lossos as the preeminent power on Olympia. Through Perturabo's military campaigns, Dammekos brought 100 city-states under his heel, with countless more cowed into submission. But there was something wrong. Despite being given every advantage, despite being raised in luxury and power, despite having a family that at least outwardly showed him affection, Perturabo remained distant, cold, untrusting. The young Primarch knew somehow that he was not of this world. He understood with a clarity that troubled even him that he was a being of deliberate design rather than natural birth. This knowledge poisoned his relationship with everything around him. When he looked at the religious Olympians with their temples and prayers and superstitions, he saw only foolishness. He believed in the cold logic of science and reason, in mathematics and engineering, in provable facts rather than comforting lies. The Olympians' faith disgusted him. More than that, he never trusted them. Not really. Perturabo refused to return any affection offered by Dammekos, no matter how genuine it might have been. When his foster father spent time with him, trying to bond with his adopted son, Perturabo gave nothing back. He shunned his brothers Heracon and Andos completely, treating them as rivals or annoyances rather than family. The only exception was Calliphone. His foster sister was different. Dammekos himself considered Calliphone the most capable of all his children, the one best suited to succeed him as tyrant, but Olympian culture wouldn't allow a woman to hold such power. Perhaps that shared sense of being underestimated, of having ability that went unrecognised because of circumstances beyond one's control, created a bond between them. Calliphone called him Beau, a pet name no one else dared use. She was the one person on Olympia who could speak frankly to Perturabo without him shutting down completely. But even she couldn't reach the deepest parts of him. Even she didn't know about the visions that haunted him, the sense of a great maelstrom churning at the edge of perception, pulling at him, calling to him. He told no one about this, fearing it would be seen as weakness, as madness. So he buried it deep and focused on what he could control: war, engineering, conquest. When Perturabo came of age, he chose his own name in a ceremony that shocked Olympia's traditionalists. Custom dictated that he should take a name from Dammekos's venerated family history, honouring the lineage that had taken him in. Instead, Perturabo chose an ancient name he'd discovered in a forgotten text from before the Age of Strife, a document written in a language only his precocious ability had allowed him to translate. What Perturabo truly meant, he never divulged to anyone. but the choice itself was a statement. I am not one of you. I belong to something greater, something older, something you could never understand. Then came the wars. Oh, the wars. Perturabo waged campaigns on behalf of Dammekos that reshaped Olympia's political landscape. He oversaw the construction of siege engines once thought technologically impossible on the planet. Weapons and munitions birthed from his genius mind turned battles into massacres. Victory followed victory, and with each triumph, Perturabo's reputation grew. He became known as a merciless, bloody-handed warlord. Cities that resisted were ground to dust. Fortresses that seemed impregnable fell to his relentless mathematical approach to warfare. There was no glory in what Perturabo did. No tales of heroic last stands or noble sacrifices. There was only the cold certainty of defeat against an enemy who calculated every variable and exploited every weakness. In a brief span of years, Lokos became the most powerful and feared domain on Olympia, with Dammekos its undisputed master and Perturabo his lord of iron. But this dominance brought new threats. Subjugated tyrants, reasoning correctly that without Perturabo Lokos' supremacy would crumble, launched countless assassination attempts. Poisoned wine, knives in the dark, elaborate traps, and worse, far worse, were the attempts that came from within. From people who called Perturabo family and friend to his face, but secretly held him in terror or jealous hatred. This constant paranoia, this endemic culture of betrayal and intrigue, shaped Perturabo in ways that would echo across the galaxy. He learned to trust no one. He learned that affection was a weapon, that kindness was a mask, that everyone wanted something from him. The only things he could truly rely on were logic, mathematics, and the strength of fortified walls. Everything else was illusion. When the Emperor's Great Crusade finally reached Olympia in 849 of the 30th millennium, Perturabo had been expecting it. He'd reasoned out, at least in abstract, that he was an artificial being, a posthuman designed for a purpose. He knew his creator would one day come looking for him. So when the Emperor's fleet appeared in Olympia's skies, when the master of mankind himself descended to meet his wayward son, Perturabo didn't resist. He immediately submitted himself to the Emperor's mercy, and in doing so, he ousted the tyrant Dammekos from power. The Emperor, following established imperial practice, declared Perturabo lord of the world where he'd been raised. Dammekos, for all his cunning and all his years of rule, was deposited without ceremony. In later years, the old tyrant would spend his remaining time gathering forces in a futile attempt to retake his power, to overthrow both Perturabo and the Imperium that had stolen his adopted son. He failed, but his efforts left a current of anti-imperial sentiment among Olympia's populace, a slow-burning resentment that would have catastrophic consequences decades later. Perturabo was given command of the 4th Legion, the Space Marines created from his own genetic template. These were the Iron Warriors, and they would reflect their Primarch's personality in every brutal, unforgiving detail. But before we get to that, we need to understand what the Emperor gave Perturabo along with his legion. He gave him purpose. He gave him brothers, other Primarchs with abilities matching his own. He gave him the stars themselves, an entire galaxy to reconquer and rebuild. He gave him everything Perturabo had ever wanted, and somehow, impossibly, it still wasn't enough. When Perturabo took command of the Iron Warriors, his first act was to review their war record. He analysed every campaign, every victory, every loss. He examined their doctrines, their practices, their effectiveness as a fighting force. And when he finished his analysis, he found them wanting. His response was decimation, not as punishment for failure in the field, not as retribution for some specific offence, simply because they did not meet his standards. By lottery, 1 in every 10 Iron Warriors was selected. Those unlucky enough to draw the fatal lot were then beaten to death by their 9 brothers. The Legion was forced to murder itself, to spill its own blood, to prove through this horrific ritual that they would follow their Primarch's orders no matter how monstrous those orders might be. Such would be Perturabo's reign, brutal and unforgiving from the very first moment. The Iron Warriors went on to fight in the Great Crusade with a dedication that bordered on madness. They were siege specialists, masters of the grinding, unglamorous warfare that breaks fortresses and grinds defenders into paste. When other legions faced an impregnable stronghold and pulled back to regroup, to plan, to find another way, the Iron Warriors were called in. They would build their siege works with mathematical precision, bring up their artillery and commence the methodical destruction of whatever stood in their way. They didn't ask for quarter, and they granted none. Surrender or die were the only options they offered, and they seemed to prefer it when the enemy chose death. This made them incredibly effective. It also made them unpopular. Siege warfare is the most grinding, demoralizing type of warfare that exists. Long periods of tedium and backbreaking labour, broken by episodes of savage close-quarters brutality. The Iron Warriors embraced this completely. They saw the storming of the breach as an escape from the tedium, and they developed into ferocious close-quarters fighters who revelled in the violence because it meant the waiting was finally over. But here's where things started going wrong. The Iron Warriors were too good at what they did. Far too good. And because they were so effective at siege warfare and garrison duty, they found themselves assigned to those roles constantly. After conquering a world, the Iron Warriors would often be ordered to leave behind garrisons to watch over the newly compliant populations. Units would be detached from the Legion to act, as permanent watchdogs, slowly diminishing the Legion's active crusading strength. The most famous example was the Iron Keep on Delgus II, where a single squad of 10 Iron Warriors watched over a disgruntled population of 130 million. 10 warriors, 130 million potential enemies, and they held that world through sheer intimidation and iron discipline. This typecasting inflicted serious damage to the Legion's morale. Space Marines are built for conquest, for expansion, for pushing the frontiers of human space ever outward. But the Iron Warriors found themselves spread thinner and thinner, their strength sapped by garrison duty, their warriors grinding away at thankless tasks while other legions gathered glory and accolades. Even Space Marines need rest. The Crusade gave them none. And it wasn't just garrison duty. The Iron Warriors were consistently assigned the most brutal, most costly campaigns. When a world needed to be broken and the Imperium didn't care about the Butcher's Bill, the 4th Legion got the call. They were used as shock troops, as sledgehammers to crack open impossible defences, as the expendable workhorses who would pay whatever price was necessary to achieve victory. Perturabo accepted every assignment without protest. Every single one. It's unclear why he never pushed back, never argued for better treatment, never demanded that his legion be rotated out of these meat grinder roles. Perhaps he saw it as his duty. Perhaps he believed that by accepting every impossible task, he would eventually earn the recognition he craved. Or perhaps deep down he agreed with the assessment that his legion was expendable. Whatever the reason, the Iron Warriors bled for the Imperium in ways that other legions never had to experience, and they received no thanks for it. No parades, no honours, no recognition that they were achieving victories other legions would have considered impossible. Meanwhile, they watched their brother legions accumulate glory. The Blood Angels fought with artistry and nobility. The Ultramarines built efficient, prosperous realms in their wake. The Space Wolves earned a fearsome reputation as the Emperor's executioners. And the Imperial Fists? The Imperial Fist built fortresses, which brings us to Rogal Dorn. The rivalry between Perturabo and Dorn defined both of them in ways that went far beyond healthy competition. Both Primarchs specialised in siege warfare. Both were masters of fortification. Both understood the cold mathematics of defensive warfare better than almost anyone else in the galaxy. But where Perturabo saw himself as the Imperium's unappreciated workhorse, Dorn was the shining exemplar, the noble defender, the Emperor's favourite son who could do no wrong. After the successful conclusion of the Ullanor Crusade, the greatest triumph of the Great Crusade up to that point, Dorn and his imperial fists were given the honour of fortifying the imperial palace on Terra itself. This was the ultimate validation, the greatest possible recognition of the 7th Legion's skill. They would defend the Emperor's own home, the throne world of the Imperium, the beating heart of humanity's new galactic empire. Perturabo was assigned to another meaningless garrison duty somewhere in the galactic periphery. Then came the moment that perhaps sealed the hatred between them forever. At a gathering of Primarchs, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children asked Rogal Dorn a hypothetical question. Could the Imperial Palace withstand an assault by the Iron Warriors? Dorn's answer was measured, practical, utterly truthful. The palace could withstand any adversary, including the Iron Warriors, provided it was adequately manned. It was a simple statement of fact. Dorn wasn't boasting. He wasn't insulting Perturabo. He was just answering the question with his typical blunt honesty. But to Perturabo, who was already drowning in resentment and bitterness, it sounded like the cruelest insult imaginable. His brother, his rival, the one who always received the glory Perturabo felt he deserved, had just publicly declared that his fortifications could withstand anything the Iron Warriors could throw at them. It was professional, it was factual, and it made Perturabo want to tear down the Imperial Palace stone by stone just to prove Dorn wrong. Later, much later, Rogal Dorn would reflect on this moment with regret. He would recognise that his overly competitive relationship with Perturabo demonstrated personal weakness, that his truthful answer had unnecessarily inflamed his brother's already considerable grievances, but by then it was far, far too late to matter. The bitterness consumed Perturabo. He brooded over every slight, real and imagined. He catalogued every injustice, every moment when another Primarch received credit for achievements he felt should have been his. He compared his brutal, thankless campaigns with the glorious victories his brothers won, and he found himself rotting from within with loathing and spite. The iron facade the Iron Warriors presented to the Imperium obfuscated the extent of how deeply they had descended into this darkness. On the surface, they remained the Emperor's most reliable siege troops, the legion you called when nothing else would break the enemy's defences, but underneath, they were hollow men going through the motions, performing their duty with mechanical precision, while their souls curdled with resentment. And then, possibly through the subtle manipulations of Horus Lupercal, the Iron Warriors were assigned to what might have been their most horrific campaign yet. A campaign so brutal, so pointless, so utterly wasteful, that it finally broke something fundamental in Perturabo and his legion. They were sent to purge the Hrud from the Sak'trada Deeps. The Sak'trada Deeps campaign began in the year 999 of the 30th millennium, just 1 year before the outbreak of the Horus heresy. The region consisted of the Sak'trada Deeps themselves along with the Vulpa Straits, a collection of star systems that the War Council had deemed in need of cleansing. The problem? The Hrud. The Hrud are one of the strangest, most terrifying xeno species in the galaxy. The Imperium first encountered them during the Great Crusade, and initial reports labelled them as the Nocturnal Warriors of Hrud, though whether Hrud was the name of their species or their homeworld remained unclear. What was clear was that fighting the Hrud was unlike fighting any other enemy. The Hrud possess abilities that defy conventional warfare. They exist in a state of semi-reality, wrapped in what they call Sak, entropic fields that warp space and time around them. When you look at a Hrud directly, your eyes slide off them. They appear as shifting shadows, rat-like creatures with spinal assemblies for limbs, creatures that seem to exist partially outside normal reality. Other senses are more reliable for detecting their presence. The Sak alters atmospheric composition, thickening the air with accelerated particular motion. Extreme temperature changes precede them, killing cold followed by unbearable heat. But the worst part, the truly horrifying part, is what the Sak does to anyone who gets too close. The entropic fields cause rapid aging. Not metaphorical aging, actual physical aging measured in centuries or millennia compressed into seconds. Iron Warriors fighting the Hrud found ceramite armour pitting and corroding as if left in the elements for 5,000 years. Weapons disintegrated after blocking Hrud blades. Space Marines stabbed by Hrud melee weapons exploded as their bodies forced themselves into impossible shapes, their gene seed implants rejected by rapidly aging flesh. Some warriors hit by Hrud weapons age backwards, reverting to children and then infants before dissolving into genetic material. The Hrud deployed weapons that could shunt targets fractions of a second along their own timeline, causing them to become fused with objects around them as the planet's motion continued while they stood still. They created focused temporal vortices that rotted enemies from the inside out. And all of this while remaining nearly invisible, warping space and light around themselves, forcing the Iron Warriors to rely on thermal imaging that still couldn't fully penetrate the heat bloom caused by overclocked atomic activity in the SSAC. This was what Perturabo and the Iron Warriors were ordered to fight, and they dutifully obeyed, because that's what they always did. The campaign was a nightmare. The Iron Warriors pushed into the Hrud Warrens, clearing them system by system, world by world. On Gugan, they fought through lightless tunnels where time itself became unreliable. Warriors went into battle in their prime and came out aged 3,000 years, their bodies wizened and breaking down even as their minds remained trapped in functional but dying flesh. One of these warriors was Barabbas Dantiok, warsmith of a Grand Company, and one of the Iron Warriors' most capable commanders. Dantiok watched half his Grand Company lost in the fighting on Gugan. He himself was aged approximately 3,000 years by the Hrud's entropic powers, his body crippled and his face transformed into that of an ancient man. But his mind remained sharp enough to see what Perturabo apparently could not or would not see. This campaign was pointless. The Sak'trada Deeps held no strategic value. The worlds they were fighting for were worthless. The Hrud themselves, while dangerous, posed no existential threat to the Imperium. They were just there. Infesting worlds humanity had marked for colonization or exploitation, but not actively threatening anyone who left them alone. And the Iron Warriors were bleeding for these worthless rocks in the void. Perturabo, along with Magost Zurin IV of the Mechanicum, eventually developed a solution. They constructed stasis field generators that negated much of the Hrud's entropic fields, giving the Iron Warriors an advantage they'd previously lacked. The technology worked. It allowed them to inflict heavy casualties on the Xenos, to push them back, to achieve something resembling victory. But victory had a cost. The Hrud, faced with this new threat that could negate their primary defense, panicked. And when the Hrud panic, they migrate. Not in small groups, not in organized retreats. They migrate en masse by the billions, fleeing in vast exoduses to escape the threat. Thousands of Hrud migration vessels launched from Gugan. Behind them came continent-sized warrens, massive structures that broke free from the planet itself, using the substance of the world as fuel to achieve escape velocity. These weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were mobile habitats the size of land masses, protected by entropic fields so powerful they distorted reality around them. The Iron Warriors fleet moved to intercept. They couldn't allow the Hrud to escape and infest other systems. But the Hrud's migration created something the Iron Warriors hadn't anticipated and couldn't prepare for. A temporal shockwave. The leading migration vessel, that continent-sized warren, overloaded its temporal drives in a catastrophic failure. The explosion wasn't just physical, it was temporal. A wave of distorted time rippled outward, washing over the Iron Warriors' fleet before anyone could react. Ships aged decades in seconds. Void shields failed as their generators corroded into scrap. Weapon systems seized up, their components fusing together or simply disintegrating. Crew members died at their stations, their bodies rotting away to skeletons. The Iron Warriors' flagship, the Iron Blood, only survived by ramming one of its disabled sister ships, using the crippled vessel as a shield to buy precious seconds to escape the worst of the temporal distortion. When it was over, the Iron Warriors' fleet was shattered. It took them a week just to reassemble what remained of their forces and assess the damage. And Perturabo, standing on the bridge of his wounded flagship, looking out at the debris of his fleet and the corpses of his sons, could only blame the Emperor, not the Hrud, not the Xenos who had actually caused the damage. The Emperor! Because this campaign, this pointless, grinding, brutal campaign in a strategically worthless system, had been ordered by the War Council. It had been demanded by the Imperium. And Perturabo had accepted the order without protest, as he always did, because he was the dutiful son, the reliable one, the expendable one who would pay any price to achieve victory. Some have speculated that it was actually Horus Lupercal who engineered this campaign, who falsified orders from Terra to send the Iron Warriors to the Sak'trada Deeps specifically to break Perturabo's spirit. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. The Iron Warriors emerged from the Hrud campaign battered, depleted, and seething with resentment. It was in the aftermath of Gaghan that Warsmith Dantiok, his body twisted and aged, his grand company decimated, made the mistake of questioning Perturabo's judgment. Standing before his Primarch, bowing not in respect but because his aged frame could barely support itself, Dantiok spoke words that would seal his fate. They should have retreated. Even their victories were making the Hrud fight harder. The campaign was a mistake. Perturabo's response was immediate and brutal. Dantiok was demoted and exiled to Lesser Damantine, sent away from the Legion not because he was wrong, but because he had the audacity to point out the obvious. The Lord of Iron would accept no criticism, not even from one of his most accomplished sons, especially not criticism that highlighted his own errors in judgment. And it was there, with the Iron Warriors' fleet still reassembling, with warriors still dying from age-related complications, with the futility of their sacrifice hanging over them like a shroud, that news arrived from Olympia. The homeworld had risen in rebellion. The news reached Perturabo while his fleet still limped through the void, licking wounds that would never fully heal. Olympia, the world where he'd been raised, the seat of the Iron Warriors' power, the source of generations of recruits who had bled for the Imperium, was in open rebellion against Imperial rule. Dammekos was dead. The old tyrant had finally succumbed to age, and with his death, the delicate political balance he'd maintained collapsed. The duplicitous, viperous politics that Perturabo remembered from his youth had reasserted themselves with a vengeance. City-states that had submitted to Lossus's dominance saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. Old grudges, buried but never forgotten, erupted into violence. The political infighting and insurrection flared up worse than ever before. But there was more to it than just political instability. The violence and division had been building for decades, fed by changes the Imperium had wrought on Olympia after bringing it to compliance. The planet had been transformed into a recruitment world for the Iron Warriors, and that transformation came with a terrible cost. Generations of Olympia's finest youth had been tithed for the 4th Legion. Young men and women at the peak of their physical ability, the strongest and most capable of their generation, were taken away to become Space Marines, and they never returned. The Iron Warriors didn't maintain close ties with their homeworld the way some legions did. There were no triumphant returns, no parades of victorious heroes coming home to show what they had accomplished. The young people of Olympia were simply taken, transformed into transhuman warriors, and sent to die on battlefields so distant that even their names were meaningless to those left behind. An entire planet was slowly being bled dry of its best and brightest, with nothing to show for the sacrifice, no glory, no recognition, no sense that the deaths meant anything. The people of Olympia watched their children disappear into the void and received only silence in return. This discontent had been carefully nurtured. Unknown to Perturabo at the time, the Wordbearers Legion had been working behind the scenes, covertly engineering the rebellion. Lorgar's sons, already turned to chaos, had infiltrated Olympia and spread propaganda, exploited grievances, and carefully pushed the populace toward open revolt. It was all part of Horus's grand design to break the Iron Warriors completely, to push Perturabo past the point of no return, and it worked perfectly. When the news reached Perturabo, something inside him snapped. This was the final betrayal, the ultimate insult. He had given Olympia to the Imperium. He had unified the planet's warring city-states. He had built fortresses and siege engines that made it one of the most defensible worlds in its sector. He had spent his childhood bleeding for Olympia's dominance. And now, when he'd suffered unspeakable losses fighting a pointless campaign in a worthless system, when he needed his homeworld to remain stable if only to prove that some part of his life had meaning, Olympia stabbed him in the back. Perturabo immediately pulled the Iron Warriors away from the Sak'trada Deeps. The Hrud could wait. The Hrud could migrate to wherever they wanted. Olympia demanded his attention, and Olympia would get it. The Iron Warriors' fleet burned through the warp toward their homeworld with fury in their hearts. When they translated back into real space above Olympia, the planet must have looked so small, so fragile from orbit. A single world against an entire legion of space marines. The rebellion didn't stand a chance. Perturabo didn't even attempt diplomacy. He didn't try to understand the grievances that had driven his people to rebellion. He didn't consider that. Perhaps decades of taking their children with no explanation, no honour, no recognition might have bred resentment. He just saw betrayal, pure and simple, and he responded the only way he knew how. He gave the Olympians an ultimatum: enact decimation yourselves, select 1 in every 10 of your own population and execute them, or face total extermination and enslavement. Think about that for a moment. The people of Olympia, already suffering, already ground down by decades of tithes and imperial rule, were being ordered to murder their own families and neighbours, 1 in every 10. Parents forced to draw lots to see if their children would die. Children forced to select which parent would face execution. Communities forced to tear themselves apart or face something even worse. Many refused. Of course they refused. What sane person would agree to such monstrous terms? So Perturabo purged Olympia city by city, and he spared absolutely no one who resisted. The Iron Warriors fell upon their homeworld like an avalanche of ceramite and bolter fire. They overran the fortresses Perturabo himself had built, exploiting every weakness because he knew every weakness. He designed these defences. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, where the fields of fire overlapped, where the walls would crack under sustained bombardment. Every fortification that had once filled him with pride became an enemy stronghold to be systematically dismantled. The cities burned. The Iron Warriors moved through the streets in implacable formations, showing no mercy, granting no quarter. Civilians who took up arms died. Civilians who didn't take up arms died. The Iron Warriors had spent the Great Crusade being the Emperor's sledgehammer, smashing their way through impossible defences at terrible cost. Now they turned that brutal methodology on their own people, and it was horrifyingly efficient. Some Iron Warriors refused to participate. These were warriors who still retained enough humanity, enough connection to the world that had birthed them, to recognise the horror of what they were being asked to do. They lowered their weapons. They spoke out against the madness. Perturabo had them executed alongside the Olympian rebels, his own sons killed for the crime of possessing a conscience. The purge continued for days, weeks. The death toll climbed higher and higher. Cities that resisted were reduced to rubble. Populations that fought back were exterminated down to the last child. And through it all, Perturabo drove his legion forward with mechanical precision, overseeing the genocide with the same cold calculation he'd applied to 1,000 other campaigns. By the time the massacre finally ground to a halt, 5 million Olympians were dead. 5 million. Not soldiers, not rebels. 5 million human beings of all ages, guilty only of being born on a world that had the misfortune to be Perturabo's homeworld. The survivors, those who had submitted to decimation, or surrendered quickly enough, were put into vicious slavery. They would spend the rest of their lives serving the very legion that had murdered their families. And during this nightmare, Perturabo came to Lokos itself, the city where he'd been raised, the palace where he'd grown up, where he'd learned politics and war, where he'd spent long hours in discussion with Dammekos and Calliphone. The Iron Warriors stormed the palace methodically, room by room, killing anyone who resisted. In one of the inner chambers, Perturabo found Calliphone. She was old now, far older than when he'd last seen her. The years had not been kind, and the stress of the rebellion had aged her even further. She stood by their father's tomb, haggard and tired, waiting for her adopted brother to find her. She'd known he would come, she'd known this was how it would end. And when Perturabo entered the room, Calliphone spoke her mind one final time. She'd called him beau when they were young, had been the one person who could speak frankly to him. She wasn't going to stop now just because he'd become a mass murderer. She blamed him. She blamed him for all of it. For the rebellion, for the deaths, for the nightmare that Olympia had become. She called him out for what he was, a petulant child with a martyr complex who had spent his entire life making everything as difficult and painful as possible. She told him the truth he'd never been able to face, that his suffering was largely self-inflicted, that his bitterness poisoned everything he touched, that he could have been so much more if he'd just let himself be human. Perturabo's response was to strangle her to death. He put his hands around his foster sister's throat, the throat of the only person on Olympia who had ever truly cared for him, and he squeezed until she stopped moving. And afterward, he let out a single sob, one sob, because even Perturabo in that moment understood what he'd done. He'd killed the last person who loved him. Then he went back outside to watch Olympia burn. The Iron Warriors built funeral pyres across the planet, massive structures of wood and corpses, pyres large enough to be seen from orbit, pyres that burned for days as they cleansed the world of the heaps of bodies the Fourth Legion's assault had created. The smoke rose into Olympia's sky, choking the atmosphere, turning day into a hazy twilight of ash and death. And standing there, watching the pyres burn, Perturabo and his Iron Warriors finally realized what they had done. They weren't heroes anymore. They weren't the saviors of the Imperium. One moment they'd been destroying the alien Hrud, fighting for humanity's future, and the next moment they were committing genocide against their own people, against the world that had raised them, against families and children and innocents who had no part in the rebellion except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Iron Warriors slowly comprehended the magnitude of their crime. These were Space Marines, transhuman warriors who had been mentally conditioned and hypno-indoctrinated to follow orders without question. But even they couldn't rationalize what they'd just done. Even they couldn't pretend this was acceptable. The horror of it broke through their conditioning and left them staring at their own hands in disbelief. Perturabo looked on in cold silence. Only as the great pyres burned and their smoke filled Olympia's sky did he fully realize the truth. Nothing he could ever do from this moment forward could atone for a worldwide genocide. His father, the Emperor of Mankind, would never forgive him for so grievous a sin. This was beyond redemption. This was beyond any punishment that imperial justice could prescribe. This was damnation. But you know who did forgive him? You know who not only forgave this atrocity but actively praised it? Horus Lupercal. When word reached Horus about what had happened on Olympia, the War Master's response was immediate and calculated. While the Emperor and the wider Imperium would inevitably condemn Perturabo's actions, while other Primarchs would recoil in horror at the wholesale slaughter of a loyal world, Horus saw opportunity. He commended Perturabo for his decisive action. He lauded the Lord of Iron's thoroughness in eliminating traitors to the Imperium. He praised Perturabo's dedication to duty, his willingness to make the hard choices that weaker men would shy away from. Every word was perfectly chosen to tell Perturabo exactly what he wanted to hear. You did the right thing. You're not a monster. You're strong where others are weak. This was the moment. This was when decades of resentment, bitterness, and careful manipulation by Horus all came together. Perturabo stood at a crossroads. On one path lay confession, seeking the Emperor's judgment, accepting whatever punishment his father deemed appropriate. On that path lay the slim hope of eventual redemption, though it would require humility and admission of error, qualities Perturabo had spent his entire life suppressing. On the other path lay Horus who understood. Horus who had also been underappreciated. Horus who would never judge him for what he'd done to Olympia. Horus who was offering not just forgiveness but validation. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Perturabo swore an oath of loyalty to the War Master. He pledged the Iron Warriors to Horus's cause, whatever that cause might be. And Horus, understanding the symbolic importance of this moment, presented his brother with a gift, a hammer named Forgebreaker. Forgebreaker wasn't just any weapon. It had belonged to Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands Legion, one of Perturabo's brothers. Ferrus was dead now, killed at Istvan V in the opening betrayal of what would become the Horus heresy. The hammer was stained with the blood of loyalists, a symbol of Horus's rebellion and the murder of those who had remained true to the Emperor. By accepting Forgebreaker, Perturabo was signing a pact written in his brother's blood. He was declaring his allegiance to the traitor cause. There would be no going back from this moment. It was shortly after this that the full scope of Horus's betrayal became clear. News reached the Iron Warriors that the War Master had turned traitor, taking his sons of Horus Legion into open rebellion against the Emperor. Other legions had joined him. Angron's World Eaters, Mortarion's Death Guard, Fulgrim's Emperor's Children. The galaxy was splitting apart, brother turning against brother in a civil war that would consume everything. The Emperor's response was swift. He ordered 7 legions to assemble and crush the rebellion at Istvan V, where Horus had established his base of operations. 3 legions would form the initial assault wave, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands. 4 more would follow as reinforcements, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors went to Istvan V, but they didn't go as loyalists. The Drop Site Massacre, as it would come to be known, was perhaps the most devastating betrayal in human history. The initial 3 legions landed and engaged Horus's forces, pushing them back in what seemed like the opening moves of a successful campaign. Then the second wave arrived, and instead of attacking the traitors, they attacked their brothers. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion opened fire on the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands. These were Space Marines who had fought alongside each other for decades during the Great Crusade. They knew each other's tactics, their strengths, their battle signs. They'd bled together on 1,000 battlefields, and now they were murdering each other. The 3 loyal legions were almost completely destroyed. Thousands of Space Marines died in a matter of hours, cut down by warriors they'd trusted as brothers. The Salamander's Primarch Vulcan was thought dead. The Raven Guard's Corax barely escaped with a handful of survivors, and Ferrus Manus, Perturabo's brother, the man whose hammer now hung at Perturabo's side, was killed by Fulgrim in single combat. The Iron Warriors had fully committed to Horus's rebellion. There was no ambiguity anymore, no room for doubt. They had murdered loyalists by the thousands. They had burned their bridges and declared themselves enemies of the Imperium. The only path forward now was through, all the way to Terra itself, to tear down everything the Emperor had built. And Perturabo threw himself into the war with grim determination. After decades of grinding, thankless campaigns, after watching other legions gather glory while the Iron Warriors bled in obscurity, after being treated as expendable, he finally had a war where he could fight in ways that didn't rely solely on massive sieges and trench warfare. The traitor legions were let loose across the galaxy, and the Iron Warriors relished the freedom to wage total war without restraint. Dozens of warsmiths took over planets and demanded tithes to support the heresy. The Iron Warriors built their own empire, an empire of iron carved from the ashes of the Imperium they'd once served. They established strongholds, forges and supply chains to fuel their war machine. This wasn't just rebellion. This was Perturabo finally doing what he'd always wanted to do, building his own civilization, one where the Iron Warriors would never again be expendable, never again be unappreciated. But the crowning moment, the validation Perturabo had been seeking his entire life, came at Terra itself. The Siege of Terra, the assault on the Imperial Palace, the ultimate test of fortification versus siege warfare. Rogal Dorn had spent years fortifying the palace, turning it into the most impregnable stronghold in human history. Every lesson Dorn had learned, every technique he'd mastered, every innovation in defensive architecture had been poured into making the palace unbreakable, and Horus put Perturabo in charge of breaking it. For months, the Iron Warriors hurled themselves at the palace's defences. They systematically dismantled the fortifications Rogal Dorn had built, taking perverse pleasure in destroying their rival's greatest work. Every wall they breached was a vindication. Every defensive position they overran was proof that Perturabo was the better siege master. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists, those ancient rivals, finally faced each other in the ultimate contest. Perturabo even got to confront Dorn directly on the battlefield at the Lionsgate spaceport. It wasn't the duel to the death that legend would have preferred. Perturabo refused to be baited by Dorn's taunts, refused to give his brother the honourable single combat he sought. Instead, the Lord of Iron calmly explained that he would kill Dorn only after Terra's defences had been completely subdued, only after he'd proven beyond all doubt who was the superior Primarch. In the end, Horus's rebellion failed. The Emperor confronted the War Master aboard his flagship and destroyed him, though the Emperor himself was mortally wounded in the process. The traitor legions scattered, some fleeing into the Eye of Terror, others trying to hold what remained of their empires. And the Iron Warriors? They withdrew to the empire Perturabo had built, the strongholds and fortress worlds that would become the core of their power in the millennia to come. But Perturabo wasn't done with Rogal Dorn, not even close. Their rivalry had defined too much of his life, driven too many of his decisions. He needed to prove one final time that he was the superior siege master, so he built a trap. On the world of Sebastus IV, Perturabo constructed what he called the Eternal Fortress. It was a masterwork of defensive engineering, spanning 20 square miles of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire, tank traps and redoubts. The defences formed an 8-pointed star, and at the centre was a massive bunker that served no purpose except as bait. Rogal Dorn discovered the Eternal Fortress and did exactly what Perturabo expected. He declared that he would bring Perturabo back to Terra in an iron cage. The Imperial Fists launched their assault, pushing into the defences with the determination and skill they were famous for. And Perturabo dismantled them piece by piece. He isolated the Imperial Fist from their orbital support. He fractured their formations, first by company, then by squad, until individual Space Marines fought virtually alone. He pulled back defenders to entice the Imperial Fists to push forward, then sprang traps that inflicted horrific casualties. By the 6th day, the Imperial Fists were reduced to burrowing into the mud and using the corpses of their fallen brothers for cover. Rogal Dorn personally held the line, turning back assaults that would have slaughtered his remaining warriors. His captains begged him to organise a breakout and retreat. He refused. The Imperial Fists would stand and die if necessary, because that's what Imperial Fists do. The siege lasted 3 weeks and 6 days. The Imperial Fists ran out of ammunition and fought with combat knives. They waded through trenches flooded with blood, They refused to break, refused to surrender, refused to do anything except die fighting. Only the intervention of Robert Guilliman and the Ultramarines saved them. Unable to defeat 2 full legions simultaneously, Perturabo concentrated on denying the Imperial Fists the ability to collect their dead and wounded. Over 400 bodies were never recovered, a stain on the Imperial Fist's honour that persists to this day. The Iron Cage, as it became known, was perhaps the perfect encapsulation of Perturabo's life. Meticulous genius turned to remorseless slaughter, a waste of potential in service of a petty rivalry, the inability to comprehend concepts like sacrifice and honour. It should have been his greatest triumph, proof that he was the superior siege master. Instead, it just made the Imperial Fist more famous and beloved throughout the Imperium, seen as heroes who had cleansed themselves in the fires of war. And Perturabo? Perturabo ascended to demonhood, becoming a demon prince of chaos undivided. He led the Iron Warriors deeper into the Eye of Terror, establishing a fortress world called Medrengard that would serve as their new homeworld. There, in the warped reality of the Eye, he rules still, a bitter god of iron and hatred, forever building fortresses and siege engines, forever planning the next assault on the Imperium he once served. So what happened to Olympia after Perturabo abandoned it? The answer is perhaps the most fitting epilogue to this entire tragedy. After the heresy ended and Horus was dead, the Iron Warriors retreated to their scattered strongholds to await the inevitable Imperial counterattack. Olympia, despite the genocide it had suffered, was still technically a viable world. The survivors remained enslaved to the Iron Warriors, working to support the Legion's war machine even as Loyalist forces began the Great Scouring to drive the traitors from Imperial space. The Ultramarines and Imperial Fists jointly assaulted Olympia. The world's defences, built by Perturabo himself and manned by Iron Warriors who knew every secret of those fortifications, held out for 2 full years. But the Imperium had the numbers, the resources, and the determination. Slowly, inevitably, the defences began to fail. Rather than allow their homeworld to fall into Loyalist hands, the Iron Warriors triggered their own missile stockpiles. They launched every weapon they had at Olympia itself: virus bombs, atomic warheads, chemical weapons. Everything in their arsenal was turned on the world that had birthed their legion. The Iron Warriors themselves rendered Olympia uninhabitable. The world that had once been a thriving collection of city-states, a centre of culture and military excellence, was reduced to a barren, poisoned wasteland. The Imperium, recognising that Olympia was too corrupted by chaos to ever be reclaimed, declared it a dead world and forbidden world. They left it as a monument to the Iron Warriors' hatred. Today, 10,000 years after the heresy, Olympia remains a corpse world, its surface scoured of all life, its cities broken ruins, its skies choked with toxic clouds. It stands as the eternal testament to what happens when bitterness and resentment are allowed to fester unchecked, when genius is twisted toward destruction rather than creation. The Iron Warriors continue to operate as a Chaos Space Marine Legion. Unlike many traitor legions, they never fully fractured into warbands. They maintain a loose organisational structure, with various warsmiths controlling fortress worlds and leading their own campaigns, but they all still acknowledge Perturabo as their Primarch and Gene Father. They remain siege specialists, masters of attritional warfare, the same brutal warriors they were during the Great Crusade, but they're hollow now. The Iron Warriors don't fight for glory or for some grand vision of the future. They fight because fighting is all they know how to do. They build fortresses and then tear them down. They construct elaborate siege works and then grind through defences that would make other Chaos Space Marines balk. They endure because enduring is what they were made for, even when there's nothing left worth enduring for. And somewhere in the Eye of Terror, in his fortress of hate on the demon world of Medrengard, Perturabo continues his eternal work. He designs fortifications. He calculates angles of fire and structural weak points. He plans sieges against targets both real and imaginary. He does what he's always done, what he was created to do, what he can never stop doing even though the purpose behind it died on the pyres of Olympia. This is the tragedy of Perturabo. He was a genius, perhaps the greatest military mind among all the Primarchs. He could have been a builder of wonders, an architect of a glorious future, a creator of beauty and advancement. Every skill was at his disposal, every tool was in his hands. He could have been remembered as humanity's greatest engineer. Instead, he's remembered as the Primarch who killed his own homeworld, who strangled his only friend, who threw away his humanity for the sake of a rivalry that never meant as much as he thought it did. He had everything he needed to be great, and he turned it all to ash because he couldn't let go of his bitterness. The destruction of Olympia wasn't just the murder of a world, it was the death of who Perturabo could have been. Every body on those pyres represented a part of himself he'd never get back. Every fortress he'd built there and then torn down was a dream he'd betrayed. When Calliphone died with his hands around her throat, the last piece of his humanity died with her. And when he realized the Emperor could never forgive him, that was the moment Perturabo chose to believe he was beyond redemption. That was when he decided that if he was going to be damned anyway, he might as well embrace it completely. That was when the Lord of Iron became the Primarch of bitter vengeance, and the galaxy would bleed for his choice for the next 10,000 years. If you enjoyed diving deep into the tragic lore of the Iron Warriors and Perturabo's fall from grace, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more Warhammer 40k deep dives coming, from the Siege of Terra to the secret origins of the Primarchs, and I promise you, the rabbit hole only gets deeper and more fascinating from here. The grim darkness of the far future is full of stories like this. Tales of heroes who became monsters, of choices that damned entire worlds, of tragedies written in the stars themselves. Thanks for watching, and remember, iron within, iron without. Though after what we've just witnessed, maybe that motto carries a darker meaning than the Legion ever intended.